Who's in the room? What's going on? Smile, Kyle, Cope Dog. Good to see everybody. How's everybody doing? I'm taking a look at the comments here. Les, what's going on? Smile. Good old boy. Good old boy. What's going on, Playboy? Everybody tap the like button if you would, please, right up there. Hit that little like button for me because we're going to get right into this. This is 2 hours of oral. We're not going to listen to the entire oral arguments today. We're just going to go over the fine points, and I'll give you guys the answers to the question before we even begin. So, and this is going to get into how the Supreme Court, whether you are pro-Supreme Court or against the Supreme Court. I don't like the Supreme Court. I've been adamantly against the Supreme Court since I started on social media 1 year ago. So, what we're looking at today is the New York Pistol Club versus the state of New York. So it's going to be New York Rifle and Pistol Association Incorporated versus Bruen. And I'm going to read the facts of the case. Oh, Chuck is in the... So and then I'll show you guys this. I'll give you guys a little preview here. So we do have the transparency website is coming out. I wanted to go over this a little bit. Now, this is just you guys are just seeing the precursor to this right now. So this is just the beginning. We're not starting. It's not ready yet, but this is how transparency works. What is transparency? Why transparency? So we have a lot of things in here that are just placeholders right now. And my buddy's been working on this. What is Montesquieu? ESQUIEU. Montesquieu's not spelled correct. That's okay. We're not done. We're just showing you guys this is the precursor to the website coming out. And so we have a site coming out where we're going to be talking about the different things that transparency offers, and the persons who have been working on this have put in a lot of time and energy on this. This is coming out in the next, I would say, 5 or 6 days. We should be done, and each one we're going to go over every detail of what transparency is, what transparency is about. So I want to prep you guys for this, and then we get into transparency facts, decentralization versus statism, the old way versus the new way. What are my Fourth Amendment rights? How 2 agencies change the game. When violence or crime is in progress, how would a transparency officer and a transparency agency respond? Why we must change the system. This is a big one. How come we got to change the system? Well, because it's just not working out for the common person. It's just not working out good. What's going on, Gene? How is everybody? How is everybody doing? How is everybody doing? So I can't wait for this to come out. I'm really excited about it. And so, okie dokie pokey smoky. Let me just say hello. How's everybody doing today? What is going on? What's up, Playboy? What's the good news? What's going on, Playboy? So then I took the video from last night that we made, and I don't want to raise up the stick, so I'll just point it up at me. I took the video down that we made last night that goes over my past. I'm going to put that on my backup channel. And now this channel, we're just going to move forward. We're just going to move forward. And so that's why I'm showing you guys the new transparency website is coming out. And that's why today's lecture, today's conversation with you guys is going to be about talking about this case, New York Gun and Pistol Club versus Bruen. Because if you guys don't know it, this is the case that if you live in California, Massachusetts, New Jersey, New York, those states are going to scramble to put laws in place to try to limit your Second Amendment right. On this one, the Supreme Court got it right. It remains to be seen how Roe versus Wade being overturned is going to play out. And I want to wait for this to develop a little bit before I start adding my commentary, my position, my spin, because I did write a new third party that I already have written the way I think the world should be set up. And so when I unveil that new third party, I'll be happy to show you guys what my thoughts are on Roe v. Wade and whether I'm pro-choice or pro-life or somewhere in the middle. You know, I'll let you guys know what my thoughts are when I unveil the new third party. Hey, Sly Shy, how you doing? Good to Sly. What's going on? How are you? Good to see you. Good to see everybody. Hit the number 1 button. Let me know where you guys are from. Hit the number uno buttono and let me know where you guys are from. Write it right there for me. Pretty pleased with sugar and cherry on top. Cope Dog is in the house. Henry, what's going on? Good to see you. Marcy Fox, yo. Good to see you, Marcy. You got Yum is in the house. What's up? Trump Fanatics is in the house. Shock Professor, good to see you. Bruce in Oregon, how you doing, Bruce? Good to see you, man. I'm always glad to see you in the room. Cope Dog Greg's here. Shanta Spence is in the house. Jonathan Mitchell Music is here. Adam, good to see you. Les, Matt, Lori, wow. Fake Roach, what's going on, Playboy? And then we have Israel, God bless you. I'm of Jewish descent. My last name is DeCastro. If you look that up, the origins of my life come from Jewish people. You can look, DeCastro is one of the most, it is a Jewish surname. So that's what my last name is. Good to see you, Israel. I'm glad you're here. Shalom. God bless you. Indiana, hello. Louisiana. Craig, what's going on in Louisiana? What's going on? Everybody now reach up and hit that like button if you would. Reach down if you would, please, and hit the like button. It helps get the message out into YouTube. So anybody else I didn't mention yet? Marcy Henry, what's going on? God bless you. Thank you. And then, let me show you guys this too. I did change this and I need to change it. Let me flip this around. So I changed it to a $5 coupon code. I gave away thousands and thousands of these. And now I've changed it to a $5 trifold that you put in when you check out if you want the trifold for $5. You use the coupon code $5 trifold. I just want to make sure because I still haven't changed that. I should just do that just real fast with everybody here in the room. Okie dokie. Let me just go here and let me change this to your channel. And then let's, not my channel. I'm going to go to studio settings real quick. And then we're going to jump into this case because the case is, it's a 2-hour long oral argument. So I just want to make sure that, and this down here is going to say, where's it at on the trifold indestructible paper? And then, use the word, it's $5 trifold. You can print it out at home for $5. I made that a $5 trifold now so that, because if I had collected the revenue on those, thanks, Cope Dog, for the support. Yep. Okay, so now let's jump into this case right here as quickly as we can. And I do have my Bose. 50%. I got my Bose set up here, so you guys are going to be able to hear this really, really well. And the case, this is the actual right up here on Oyez right there. This is the case. I'm going to copy that here. I'm going to put it over here. I'm going to put it in the video details. I'll just, it's not quite going to fit. Oyez, I'll put it right here. Link to audio. There that is. Okay, now you guys will be able to get that there. And now let's jump right into this. Let's jump right into it. So yeah, now this is the case that I only got a chance to listen to the first hour of this last night. So I'm gonna go over the first hour of this with you guys right now. Yo, what's up, Playboy? What is up, Play motherfucking boy? What's up? Okay, so I am in a fantastic mood. I feel absolutely amazing. So now, okay, let's get right into this audio. If you guys buckle in, really listen here. I'm going to stop this as seldomly as I possibly can. I'm only going to stop it when they go over some terms or some things that you guys should absolutely know and understand. Yosha Talong, what is going, you go to do? Boom, there you are. Okay, so now let's get right into the oral arguments of this case and hear what they have to say here. So here this is. I'm going to come down here.
We will hear argument this morning in case 2843, New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruen. Mr. Clement?
Mr. Chief Justice, and may it please the court, the text of the Second Amendment enshrines a right not just to keep arms, but to bear them. And the relevant history and tradition, exhaustively surveyed by this court in the Heller decision, confirm that the text protects an individual right to carry firearms outside the home for purposes of self-defense. Indeed, that history is so clear that New York no longer contests that carrying a handgun outside of the home for purposes of self-defense is constitutionally protected activity. But that concession dooms New York's law, which makes it a crime for a typical law-abiding New Yorker to exercise that constitutional right. This court in Heller labeled the very few comparable laws that restricted all outlets for carrying firearms outside the home for self-defense outliers that were rightly condemned in decisions like Nunn against Georgia. New York likens its law to a restriction on weapons in sensitive places. But the difference between a sensitive place law and New York's regime is fundamental. It is the difference between regulating constitutionally protected activity and attempting to convert a fundamental constitutional right into a privilege that can only be enjoined by those who can demonstrate to the satisfaction of a government official that they have an atypical need for the exercise of that right. That is not how constitutional rights work. Carrying a firearm outside the home is a fundamental constitutional right. It is not some extraordinary action. It is the difference between regulating constitutionally protected activity.
Okay, I want you guys to read this paragraph. I want to read it with you. I stopped this last night when I was listening to it, and I read this paragraph again. And it said, it is the difference between regulating constitutionally protected activity and attempting to convert a fundamental constitutional right into a privilege, your constitutional rights being converted into a privilege that can only be enjoyed by those who can demonstrate to the satisfaction of a government official that they have an atypical need, not typical, so not an abnormal need for your rights. You need an abnormal need for the exercise of that right. And then he makes a very strong statement here. He says that is not how the constitutional rights work. So I just wanted, I got a few places on here I want to stop it, and I want to just, this paragraph right here, you could take a screenshot of this and post this everywhere because he's going to win the case.
And attempting to convert a fundamental constitutional right into a privilege that can only be enjoined by those who can demonstrate to the satisfaction of a government official that they have an atypical need for the exercise of that right.
So I want to say hello to Sly. I saw you, Sly. I saw you say something. I want to say hello to everybody. Good to see everybody. We're just getting going on this case. This is the case that strips away the government forcing you to get a gun permit. It's no longer valid, so states around the country, some of them are going to try to create new laws.
That is not how constitutional rights work. Carrying a firearm outside the home is a fundamental constitutional right. It is not some extraordinary action that requires an extraordinary demonstration of need. Petitioners here seek nothing more than their fellow citizens in 43 other states already enjoy. And those states include some of the most populous cities in the country. Those states, like New York, limit the firearms in sensitive places, but do not prohibit carrying for self-defense in any location typically open to the general public.
Ohio.
I'm happy to continue by point.
Mr. Clement, sorry to interrupt you. If we analyze this and use history, tradition, text of the Second Amendment, we're going to have to do it by analogy. So can you give me a regulation in history that is a basis, that would form a basis for legitimate regulation today? If we're going to do it by analogy, what would we analogize it to? What would that look like?
Well, Your Honor, I suppose if you're going to reason by analogy, then you could, go back and you could find analogous restrictions relatively early in our nation's history about prohibiting certain types of firearms or having firearms or any weapon really, in certain sensitive locations. And I think you could reason in that way. Here, I think the reasoning works the opposite direction, which is you typically have a baseline right to carry for self-defense. And the only historical analogs that really restricted the right of a typical law-abiding citizen to carry for self-defense to the same degree as the New York law here were those laws, very few, typically post-Reconstruction laws, that purported to eliminate any right to carry openly or concealed. And those laws were essentially invalidated by every court that was applying an individual rights view of the Second Amendment. And those decisions, of course, were exhaustively considered by this court in Heller. And those decisions were praised for their understanding of the Second Amendment and the relationship between the prefatory clause and the operative clause. And equally important, those laws were set forth by this court and singled out by this court as the very few restrictions historically that were comparable to what the District of Columbia was doing in Heller.
So if we look at you mentioned the founding and you mentioned post-Reconstruction, but if we are to analyze this based upon the history or tradition, should we look at the founding or should we look at the time of the adoption of the 14th Amendment, which then, of course, applies it to the states?
Okay, so this is an important plot point that you have to understand what was just asked. If you go on to DeletelawZ.com, the server right now is down through Amazon or whatever, but when you go on there, you can get what's written called the racist origins of gun control. And so he's asking a question, essentially asking, so are you talking about when it was prohibited for blacks to get guns? Are you talking about that? That's what he's saying tongue in cheek. Remember, Clarence Thomas is a very, he could be the devil. I really, really have disdain for this man. But I've read his decisions. I've read what he holds to be constitutional, and I just can't stand him. But what he's asking the lawyer here is, what standard are we looking at here? Because remember, the adoption, and let me make it clear so you guys can truly understand it. When he says, are we analyzing this based on history or tradition? What he's asking here is, are we going to go by the history of our country that limits some people to have their guns, or the tradition of our country? So should we look at the founding, or should we look at the time of the adoption of the 14th? So when he's saying, remember, black people are officially freed in 1865. The 14th Amendment comes out in 1868. You get equal protection under the law to have your Second Amendment. History, though, would say that blacks don't get their Second Amendment. It's important you understand what he's asking the lawyer here. He's saying, are you talking about our racist past where blacks couldn't get guns? Or are you talking about the tradition that America is supposed to be based on?
So, Justice Thomas, I suppose if there were a case where there was a contradiction between those two, and the case arose in the states, I would think there would be a decent argument for looking at the history at the time of Reconstruction, and giving preference to that over the founding. I think for this case and for Heller, and I think for most of the cases that will arise, I don't know that the original founding history is going to be radically different from that at Reconstruction.
Okay, so now when he's talking about Reconstruction, that's when the 14th Amendment happens, 1868. Reconstruction's going to die with when we have a president installed. I don't want to get too distracted here. So I would think it'd be just looking at the history or the time of Reconstruction. Reconstruction is when black people got their civil liberties. So that's what he's asking, literally black questions is what he's asking.
But I guess what I would say is I do think that's about where it stops, because the point here isn't to look at history for the sake of studying history. The point is to look at the history that's relevant for understanding the original public meaning of the Second Amendment and the 14th Amendment.
Mr. Clement, how could it stop there?
Now, this is going to be Elena Kagan. I'm sorry you guys can't see her if I don't make the words big. Elena Kagan is a complete nutball. You know, between Clarence Thomas and Elena Kagan, who's nuttier? I just don't know the answer.
Heller, we made very clear that laws that restricted felons from carrying or possessing arms and laws that forbade mentally ill people from doing the same, we, basically put the stamp of approval on those laws. And those laws really came about in the 1920s, didn't they?
1911 with the Sullivan Act. You can look that up. Not the 20s, the 1911 Sullivan Act. She's a little bit off on her history.
Justice Kagan, I think some of those laws in their current form took that shape in the 1920s, but I also think there was a tradition from the beginning for keeping certain people outside of the group of people that were eligible for possession of firearms. I think obviously there was a different tradition with respect to felons, in part because, you start at the time of the framing and most felonies are capital crimes. So, the need to disenfranchise felons for firearm possession was a little different at the framing. So I think you do need to make those kind of adjustments. But I think those adjustments can be made. I think really there are two reasons to at least be skeptical of post-1871 history. The first is I just don't really understand why it's terribly relevant in forming the original public meaning of the Constitution. But of course, the second reason is it's just about that time that the collective rights view started to creep into the decisions of some state Supreme Courts. And I think, so in Heller's a perfect example that this court didn't absolutely stop its analysis in 1871, but when it looked at those later sort of post-bellum state Supreme Court decisions, the ones that relied on a collective rights view were given very short shrift.
Okay, so let's just look at what he said here, because again, last night when I was when I was watching this without you guys, what he says here is there's two reasons to be skeptical, but really this isn't about being black. This is about whether or not you have a Second Amendment right. Just about that time, the collective rights view started to creep into the decisions of some state Supreme Courts. So he's saying to Clarence Thomas, this isn't about black people not getting guns. This is about our America, whether or not you have the right to have guns.
Make those kind of adjustments. But I think those adjustments can be made. I think really there are two reasons to at least be skeptical of post-1871 history. The first is I just don't really understand why it's terribly relevant in forming the original public meaning of the Constitution. But of course, the second reason is it's just about that time that the collective rights view started to creep into the decisions of some state Supreme Courts. And I think, so in Heller's a perfect example that this court didn't absolutely stop its analysis in 1871, but when it looked at those later sort of post-bellum state Supreme Court decisions, the ones that relied on a collective rights view were given very short shrift. And I think that's the appropriate way to sort of deal with these historical analogs.
I have two questions. One.
So this is Stephen Breyer. He has since retired from the Supreme Court.
His own history. It's law of his history. In McDonald, we had professors of history who ran departments of the English Civil War, and they all said the history in Heller was wrong. You've read the briefs here? I don't know. You read the briefs of the historian of the Air Force? And she says it's this way, and the other one says it's the other way. How are we supposed to deal with that? There's a good case. This is a wonderful case for showing both sides. So I'm not sure how to deal with the history. My other question is I'm not sure what New York does. We're talking here about outside New York City. New York says we have about 90,000 licenses to carry concealed weapons, or maybe it's 40,000, or maybe it's 10,000. But there's been no trial, there's been no proceeding. All it is dismissal on the. So how are we supposed to find out what the history is, which is my minor question really? There's a lot of debate on that. But second,
Oh, really?
how are we supposed to know what we're talking about in terms of what New York does, since they say they give, including to one of your clients, they give a license to carry a concealed weapon. So there are concealed weapon licenses all over the place. So what are we supposed to do about those two things?
Well, Justice Breyer, let me start with the major question, which is, because I think that's actually very straightforwardly answered, which is there's no serious question about the experience of the individual petitioners in this case. And they both sought unrestricted licenses, and they were both denied unrestricted licenses.
Why?
Notwithstanding that they satisfy every other requirement that the state has to be licensed for concealed carry. And so I'm happy to debate why the state statistics don't really prove anything particularly relevant, but I think they're irrelevant for a more fundamental reason. I mean, if there were a debate between the parties about whether 95% or 90% of the citizens of New York were denied their confrontation rights in criminal trials, but you had before you two individuals who were clearly denied the right to confront the witnesses against them, you wouldn't worry about the other 95% or the other 90%.
That's not really the way your brief is written.
Oh,
The way your brief is written is to say, this is a regulatory scheme that deprives most people of the rights to carry arms in self-defense. And your brief puts a lot of emphasis on that. Like, don't believe the state that they're going to really take seriously people's need for self-defense because they always reject these licenses. If you had a bunch of statistics which suggests that the state is quite sensitive to people's need for self-defense and gives these licenses a significant amount of the time, you might think differently about the regulatory scheme, wouldn't you? I mean, that's the way your brief reads to me.
Well, just
So just so you know, there's a lot of talk going on right now about liberals and conservative justices. It just depends on what you consider America to be. But as far as I'm concerned, they're all horrifically bad and have nothing in common with any of us.
Kagan, 2 points. One is, I wouldn't feel any differently with respect to my two individual clients who were denied their right to exercise their Second Amendment rights. But more broadly, the reason I'm so confident that this regime is problematic on its face is because on its face, at least as interpreted by the highest court in New York, the requirement you need to show in order to carry concealed for self-defense, but not for hunting and target practice, is you have to show that you have a need for self-defense that distinguishes you from the generalized community, from the general community. So New York's law on its face says that the only way that you can carry for self-defense is if you demonstrate your atypicality with respect to your need for self-defense. And that's
because look, Mr. Koch can.
Now he's going to interrupt him.
His license, he can carry it for self-defense under the license to and from work.
He's a nutball.
And as you say, can carry it for hunting, target practice, etc. Concealed. And in your opinion, is it supposed to say you can carry a concealed gun around the streets of the town or outside just for fun?
Yes.
I mean, they are dangerous.
Oh.
I mean, so what's it supposed to say?
It's supposed to be what New York says that they give to lots of applicants, at least in other counties, which is an unrestricted license, which basically means that somebody who has demonstrated to the state that they're of good moral character, that they have all the necessary training, whatever.
40,000 or 50,000 or 60,000 is not enough. You have to show you have a good moral character, and then if you just would like to carry a concealed weapon, which is a dangerous thing, as I said, you can just do it. That's what that's, in your opinion, that's what you want. No restrictions.
Yes, no restrictions. I'm going to stop it here for a second because just so you know, Stephen Breyer wrote a book called Deference, and you guys can read the book, and what you'll hear is an old angry man who wants to be in charge of everything and doesn't care about the Constitution. Deference means respect. And so what his whole book is about you need to respect the Supreme Court. That's what his book's about. It's called Deference. So Stephen Breyer is a toad. You're listening to an old man ramble who it's like giving your grandpa the microphone at a wedding and your aunts and uncles are going, take the mic, take the mic, take the mic from him, take the mic from him, right? That's what Stephen Breyer is. And guns are dangerous, guns are dangerous. And I knew last night when I listened to this last night, it triggered me, and it's triggering me again now. Guns are dangerous, so is only allowing the state to have guns or limiting us to have little pop shooters while the state has automatic weapons and helicopters. We have guns to overthrow a tyrannical government. That's the reason why we have guns in the United States. It's not for hunting. It's not for fishing. It is for self-protection. You're right, for self-protection. But the other reason we have guns is to overthrow a tyrannical government if it has to be done. This guy's
Well, certainly New York is entitled to have laws that say that you can't have weapons in sensitive.
You have to show you have a good moral character, and then if you just would like to carry a concealed weapon, which is a dangerous thing, as I said.
It's dangerous.
You can just do it, that's what the fourth, that's in your opinion.
Dangerous freedom.
That's what you want. No restrictions.
No, exactly.
Well,
yes.
Certainly New York is entitled to have laws that say that you can't have weapons in sensitive places, in addition to whatever
No, I'm not saying
regulation.
Right.
And New York has those laws, and we don't challenge those. What we're asking for, I mean, one way to think about it is we're asking that the regime work the same way for self-defense as it does for hunting.
Exactly.
When my clients go in and ask for a license to concealed carry for hunting purposes, what they have to tell the state is they have an intent to go hunting. They don't have to say, I have a really good reason to go hunting. I don't have to say I have a better reason to go hunting than anybody else in my general community. And
well, the difference, of course, you have a concealed weapon to go hunting. You're out with an intent to shoot, say, a deer or a rabbit, which has its problems. But here, when you have a self-defense just for whatever you want to carry a concealed weapon, you go shooting it around and somebody gets killed.
Oh,
with
shut
respect,
up.
Justice Breyer, that's not been the experience in the 43 jurisdictions that allow their citizens to have the same rights that my clients are looking for. This is not something where we're asking you to take some brave new experiment that no jurisdiction in Anglo-American history has ever done.
May I? You're talking about 43 other jurisdictions.
Okay, she's going to go off, and she's terrible. This is the same woman who said there was 1 million babies on ventilators, okay? She is a nutball.
And I suspect that when we get into those 43 other jurisdictions, that there are going to be a handful that are identical. The one thing that I've looked at in this history is the plethora of regimes that states pick. And that starts in English law, through the colonies, through post-Constitution, to post-Civil War, to the 19th century, to even now. Those 43 states that you're talking about, most of them didn't give unrestricted rights to carry in one form or another until recent times. Before recent times, there were so many different regulations. What it appears to me is that the history tradition of carrying weapons is that states get a lot of deference on this. And the one difference that you haven't addressed is, the question presented is, what's the law with respect to concealed weapons? In 1350, the British Parliament specifically banned the carrying of concealed.
I don't give a dang if they banned carrying weapons, if the British Parliament banned people carrying weapons in 1315. I don't care.
Arms. In colonial America, at least 4, if not 5 states restricted concealed arms.
I don't care.
After the Civil War, there were many, many more states, some included in their constitution, that you can have a right to arms but not concealed.
Yeah, because you know what? If you can conceal a gun, you're not going to be a mass shooter. You're not going to go kill a bunch of people in a school if you can conceal it, right? Wrong. It doesn't matter if they can conceal it or not. Crazy people are going to shoot people.
You can go to Alabama, Georgia, and Louisiana, which are now more open, are more free in granting the right to carry guns, but they prohibited, through their history, concealed weapons, the carrying of concealed weapons. It seems to me that if we're looking at that history and tradition with respect to concealed arms, that there is not the same requirement that there is in the home. One of the things Heller pointed to was there were few regulations that prohibited the carrying or the keeping of arms in homes. But that's not true with respect to the regulations about keeping of arms outside of homes. Putting aside the prohibitions, regulations on sensitive places, regulations on the types of people, it seems to me that I don't know how I get past all that history.
Well,
Without you...
Thou shalt not be infringed is how you get past that history, Elena.
sort of making it up
Sonia Mayor.
and saying there's a right to control states that has never been exercised in the entire history of the United States, as to how far they can go in saying this poses a danger.
So, Justice Sotomayor, there's a lot to that question. I'll try to take it, sequentially if I can. Let's start with concealed carry restrictions. It is true that during time periods where open carry was allowed, that some states did specifically restrict concealed carry on the precise theory that if we allow you to carry open, then if you're carrying concealed, you're probably up to no good. And Heller did exhaustively survey those cases. And what it concluded is that if a state allows open carry, then it can prohibit concealed carry. I suppose vice versa.
But you're asking us to make the choice for the legislature. We're only looking at concealed here.
We are not asking you to make that. And
Oh, yeah, you are, because you're conditioning history on a different fact.
I don't think we're asking for anybody to make that choice. In fact, the relief we've asked for is to have an unrestricted license because under New York law, as it currently exists, that's the only way that you can have a carry right for a handgun. But in framing our relief in the complaint, we framed it so that there are other relief consistent with the decision. So if New York really wanted to say, no, we have a particular problem with concealed carry, notwithstanding that traditionally that's the only way we allow people to carry. If they want to shift to an open carry regime, they could do that consistent with everything we've said here. I don't think anybody expects that to happen because if you look at the New York law specifically, it's a law that prohibits the carrying of handguns except for permit holders. And then its provisions about permit holders speak specifically to concealed carry. So that's why we've framed our request the way we have. But what we're doing, I think, is completely consistent with the majority decision in Heller's analysis of the historical cases, which said that those very few states that tried to prohibit both concealed carry and open carry, and so gave no outlet for the right to carry a firearm for self-defense outside the home, those were the laws that the Heller majority identified as being analogous to the DC restriction in Heller that was validated.
I do know that many of the laws conditioned or retain the right of the state to decide which people were eligible.
Okay, so on that right there, I will refer you all to, you're talking about New York. So where is the basis of all gun control created? Where's the home base of all gun control that you can now read word for word in Massachusetts if you try to get a gun in Massachusetts? It's out of New York. It's the 1911 Sullivan Act. The 1911 Sullivan Act that comes out of New York is exactly what this fight is about today. And what she just said is many of the laws conditioned to retain the right to the state to decide who was eligible for a permit. Well, let me just give you a little insight. The 1911 Sullivan Act released 25,000 gun permits to anybody that they deemed worthy in the state of New York. You know whose name was on that? Donald Trump. Donald Trump's grandfather was on that list in 1911 of persons who were eligible to have a gun permit. So that would be the government picking and choosing which individuals get to have their constitutional rights and which ones don't.
And the historians to carry the arms, that you had to be subject to the approval of the local sheriff or the local mayor, etc. And during the Civil War, that was used to deny black people the right to hold arms. We now have the 14th Amendment to protect that. But why is a good cause requirement any different than that discretion that was given to local officials to deny the carrying of firearms to people that they thought it was inappropriate, whether it was the mentally ill or any other qualification? That's how I see the good cause, as fitting in within that tradition.
So let me make a point about how it's so different from that tradition, but then also let me make a historical point. It's radically different to say that if you are a typical New Yorker, so you
now have the 14th Amendment.
Okay, so read what she says here. Accidentally, I was able to get all their heads in there. So read what this says here. We have the 14th Amendment to protect that, but why is a good cause requirement any different than that discretion that was given to local officials? Because then if there's a good cause requirement, then the state can just decide. The local officials can decide who's going to get to have guns and who doesn't. This is the 1911 Sullivan Act. Maybe someone can put the link in the comments.
And to protect that. But why is a good cause requirement any different than that discretion that was given to local officials to deny the carrying of firearms to people that they thought it was inappropriate, whether it was the mentally ill or any other qualification? That's how I see the good cause, as fitting in within that tradition.
No. So the 14th Amendment allows equal protection under the law. The 14th Amendment, what that says, and it was made for black folks, that they enjoy the constitutional rights regardless of previous enslavement or not. That's what the 14th Amendment says. The Second Amendment gives you the right to bear arms. And this is going to go back to Cruikshank. I don't want to get into the Cruikshank versus United States. I don't want to get into it.
So let me make a point about how it's so different from that tradition, but then also let me make a historical point. It's radically different to say that if you are a typical New Yorker, so you satisfy every other qualification, you're not a felon, you don't have any mental health problems, you've done everything else we've asked you, but you are typical in the sense that you don't have an atypical need to carry for self-defense. I don't think there's any historical analog to that. As to the historical examples, with all due respect, I don't think I read the surety laws the same way that you do. Those surety laws, which were only in place in a minority of jurisdictions, but nonetheless, I think they help us. Because those surety laws, first of all, start with the proposition that there's a baseline right for every person, every member of the people protected by the Second Amendment to carry. And what they do is, if somebody essentially as a complainant can come into court and say that somebody has a propensity to use them in an offensive or violent way, then if you satisfy a neutral fact finder, then you don't automatically get to disarm that person.
Bang.
You put them to the choice of posting a surety, and then they can continue to possess their firearm.
Mr. Clement, in your opening, you talked about the right applying in any location typically open to the general public. I'd like to get some sense about what you believe could be off limits, like university campuses. Could they say you're not allowed to carry on a university campus?
No.
So, Mr. Chief Justice, I think the answer to your question is yes.
No.
And I think that what I would say, though, first of all, is the language I was talking about, any location open to the general public, that's right from the license denial on Joint Appendix page 41. So there wasn't loose language on my part. That's right there from where we are told in capital letters where we cannot carry. Any location, all caps, typically open.
What sort of place do you think they could be excluded from? In other words, you can get a permit, but the state can impose certain restrictions. For example, any place in which alcohol is served. So they say you cannot carry a gun in any place where alcohol is served.
So, Mr. Chief Justice, I think probably the right way to look at those cases would be look at them case by case and say, okay, in this court in Heller, for example, said sensitive places.
Do you notice what he keeps doing? He keeps going down and what I call sitting down in case precedent in the stare decisis of the decisions. Every time he gets a question that's difficult, he goes right back into case precedent, which is Heller.
Include government buildings and schools. I think those you can probably tap into a pretty good tradition. I think any place that served alcohol would be a tougher case for the government. I think we would have a stronger case. They might be able to condition the license holder on not consuming any alcohol. There might be a variety of laws, and we could have those debates.
But what about the football stadium?
I think, again, football stadium, you'd probably take it on its own and look to the historical analogs. But here's, I guess, if I could offer some general principles. I think there's two principles. One is...
Do you notice how the lawyer doesn't answer the question? He doesn't answer. He just sits down in case precedent and then goes into principles of law. Listen carefully what the lawyer does.
I think, again, football stadium, you'd probably take it on its own and look to the historical analogs. But here's, I guess, if I could offer some general principles.
General principles.
I think there's two principles. One is, restriction of access to the place is something that I think would be consistent with the way government buildings have worked and schools have worked. Not any member of the general public can come in there. They restrict access. With or without a gun, if you're an adult that has no business to be in a school, you're excluded. So I think that's a factor that would support treating that as a sensitive place. A second principle that I would offer is these sensitive place restrictions really are a different animal than a carry restriction, because I think a true sensitive place restriction is not just going to limit your ability to carry concealed, but it's going to be, say, this is a place where no weapons are allowed. Whether they're firearms or other weapons, no weapons.
How good of an idea is this, though? We keep on seeing this idea play out in our schools across America, in our grocery stores, in restaurants, where they say you can't carry your gun in here, and then a madman comes in and starts killing people. And you want me to have my gun. You want that.
Weapons are allowed. And then the third point that I would say, and this is just an analogy, but I think it's a useful analogy, is I think the way to think about this is a little like the non-public forum doctrine in the First Amendment, which is you start with the place and you try to understand, is this a place where, given the nature of the place, its function, its restrictions on access, that weapons are out of place? And if so, that's probably a sensitive place where the state can say.
But I think what the Chief Justice is trying to do is figure out how those cash out in the real world. So I'll give you a few more. New York City subways.
So, I think that the question of whether you could restrict arms in the subways, you'd have to go through the analysis, I think, and say, is there restriction on access generally, I suppose?
No, I got the analysis, okay. All three parts of it. Like, how does it cash out? What does it mean?
I don't know how those are going to cash out in particular cases, because I think the way that you would normally deal with that is you'd look at all the briefing we had in this case on the history of these various things. And so, on behalf of my individual clients, I suppose I could give away the subway because they're not looking to go, they're not in Manhattan, they're in Rensselaer County.
You started with universities and you said that would be all right. Did you mean that?
Yeah, yes, I did mean that.
Because that's open for, anybody can walk around the NYU campus.
Right, anybody.
Well, NYU doesn't have much.
Just so you guys know, NYU campus is wide open. You can ride your bike on it. You can walk right through it. If they were going to ban guns on NYU campus, you wouldn't be able to walk through that part.
A campus?
I would go back to New York, and I think you'll find that that's wrong. Similarly, It's the Columbia campus.
Columbia's got a campus, and I don't know whether they restrict access there at all. And maybe, if they don't restrict access to parts of the campus, maybe those are parts of the campus where they wouldn't enforce the policy anyways. The point I'm trying to make,
But you can't say, there are 50,000 people in one place, a ballpark. There are 50,000 people in one place. They're all on top of each other. We don't want guns there. That's you couldn't. The city or the state couldn't do that.
Aren't the cops going to have guns there? Aren't the police going to have guns there? The current regime of law enforcement?
I think they might well be able to, because again, you can't get into Yankee Stadium without a ticket. I'd have to understand many of these. I don't know every jurisdiction. I don't know enough about Yankee Stadium. But, a lot of these stadiums are not run by the government anyway. So if a private entity wants to restrict access, I don't know where the state action is for this.
Suppose the state says no protest or event that has more than 10,000 people.
I think that might be trickier. Maybe they could justify that under strict scrutiny, but I don't think that would be a sensitive.
That would be struck down under the First Amendment right to assemble.
Places.
But why not? I mean, I guess it's about the level of generality. All these questions that Justice Kagan's asking.
So this is Amy Barrett Coney now over here on the corner. I don't want to move the words, but Amy Barrett Coney, you can see her light up ever so slightly when she speaks over there.
Or that the chief asked you, if you concede, as I think the historical record requires you to, that states did outlaw guns in sensitive places, can't we just say Times Square on New Year's Eve is a sensitive place?
No.
Because now we've seen, people are on top of each other. We've had experience with violence. So we're making a judgment. It's a sensitive place.
No.
So here's what I would suggest, that the right way to think about limiting guns in Times Square on New Year's Eve is not as a sensitive place, but as a time, place, and manner restriction. And that might be a perfectly reasonable time, place, and manner restriction. But I don't think that's the sensitive places doctrine as I understood it from, and obviously
the sensitive places doctrine. Have you guys read that? Have you guys heard of that before? How many people have heard of that? Give me yes or no. Yes, I've heard of the sensitive places doctrine, or no, I have not heard of the sensitive places doctrine. How many people have heard of that? How many people have ever heard of the sensitive places doctrine? 1, yes, I've heard of it. 2, no, I've not heard of it.
it's a brief reference in the Heller decision, so I may not fully understand it. But I understood that those were certain places where there were just no weapon zones all of the time because of the nature of that institution. And I think it's probably worth thinking about rallies and Times Square. There may be restrictions, but they would be done under the rubric of time, place, and manner.
Could we start with the purpose of the person?
Now, if you don't know anything about Samuel Alito, he loves guns.
Right to keep and bear arms. And the core purpose of that right, putting aside the military aspect, is self-defense. So starting with that, could we analyze the sensitive place question by asking whether this is a place where the state has taken alternative means to safeguard those who frequent that place? If it's a place like a courthouse, for example, a government building where everybody has to go through a magnetometer and there are security officials there, that would qualify as a sensitive place. Now, that doesn't provide a mechanical answer to every question, and but would that be a way of beginning to analyze this?
Justice Alito, that might be a way of analyzing it. The reason I'm a little bit reluctant to go that route as opposed to really think about the nature of the place and the restrictions that are associated with its core activity is because I worry that if you went that direction, then the state would say, well, this part of the city, we have a lot of police officers, and so you really don't need to exercise your own individual self-defense right there because we have your back. And I don't know what those places would be, but
Right. I don't either.
Well,
I don't
think
either.
My friends would tell you that, the whole city of New York is that way. And
Right.
I think there are a lot of people in New York, and New York may have a lot of reasons to have regulations that are a little bit different than in upstate New York where my individual petitioners reside. But I don't think that they can take all those people in New York and deny them of their fundamental constitutional.
How do we do
You just
this?
Justice Breyer?
How?
I mean, so far we've been, to my mind, I think NYU does have the campus.
Oh, Breyer,
You're not
shut
so-
up.
All right? You think that in New York City, people should have considerable freedom to carry concealed weapons.
Yes, I do.
I think that people of good moral character who start drinking a lot and who may be there for a football game or some kind of soccer game can get pretty angry at each other. And if they each have a concealed weapon, who knows? And there are plenty of statistics in these briefs to show there's some people who do know. And a lot of people end up dead. Okay?
I'm scared.
So, what are we supposed to do? To sort of float around, like with NYU, and say, hey, this is the rule. It seems to work out in upstate New York. We don't know, of course, and we do know that your client is carrying a concealed weapon because he has a right to in some instances, and even following Heller and following the history, which I thought was wrong.
Of course you did.
Even so, what are we supposed to say, in your opinion, that is going to be clear enough that we will not produce a kind of gun-related chaos?
So, Justice Breyer, I would sort of point you to two things that maybe would give you some comfort.
No, they
I
won't.
mean, one is the experience of the 43 states, and there are amicus briefs on both sides getting into the empirical evidence, but there really isn't the case that those 43 states that include very large cities like Phoenix, like Houston, like Chicago, they have not had demonstrably worse problems with this than the 5 or 6 states that have the regime that New York has. So that's one place to look. The other place that I think you would find something persuasive there is their own amicus brief on their side by the city of Chicago. Because the city of Chicago is in a shall issue jurisdiction. And the city of Chicago goes on to sort of, essentially brag about all of the ways that they've done consistent with that regime to reduce crime in Chicago that probably doesn't have a direct analog in downstate Illinois. But of course, one of the problems with this case...
I mean, most people think that Chicago is like the world's worst city with respect to gun violence, Mr. Clement.
But that's wrong.
Chicago and their corporate...
And Chicago doesn't think that, but everybody else thinks it about Chicago.
And nobody thinks that about Phoenix, and nobody thinks that about Houston, and nobody thinks that about Dallas, and nobody thinks that about San Diego, which even though it's in a restricted state, is a shall issue jurisdiction.
Thank you, Mr. Clement. Justice Thomas, anything further?
Mr. Clement, where's Mr. Nash live?
Mr. Nash lives in Rensselaer County, New York.
Is that close to NYU?
That is nowhere near NYU, Justice Thomas. And I think if you look at the county website, they talk about their 153,000 people spread over 955 square miles.
Wow.
And yet that's the context in which my individual clients are being denied their Second Amendment rights.
Justice Breyer, anything further? Justice Alito? Justice Sotomayor?
Counselor, your client is permitted to, Mr. Nash, one of the two, to carry when engaged in outdoor activities of any kind, like camping, hunting, and fishing on back roads, with a few substantially less number of people. Tell me how many places in Rensselaer County does your client have a self-defense risk?
No, it doesn't matter. It does not matter. That's just stupid.
Sir, I mean, at what point do Counselor...
It does not matter if you have a
client is
self-defense
permitted
risk.
to
Shut
Mr.
up.
Nash defense risk? Sir, I mean, at what point do we look at the restriction and the burden it places. Meaning, yes, I'm sure it has a center of town. I'm sure it may have a shopping center or two, but it's not like he's totally restricted from carrying a gun. He's just restricted from carrying one basically in those sensitive places. Because the rest of his home is pretty distant from other homes.
So Justice Sotomayor, just so we start on the same wavelength or the same page.
Because she's a nutball off in right field right now. Listen to her analysis. It was insane.
Literally page 41 of the joint appendix. This tells Mr. Nash where he can carry concealed. And what the officer, McNally, told him was, quote, I emphasize that the restrictions are intended to prohibit, italicized, you from carrying concealed in any location, all caps, any location, typically open to and frequented by the general public. Now, I would submit that's a pretty broad number of places in Rensselaer County. And it would include, I fear, most of the roads in the county at night when you're traveling and might think that you have a need. I mean, if Mr. Nash has a relative whose car breaks down and has to have a change of tire and he wants to go out and assist them with that and wants to make sure that he is in a position to defend himself, I don't think he can do it consistent with this license restriction. And at the end of the day, I think what it means to give somebody a constitutional right is that they don't have to satisfy a government official that they have a really good need to exercise it, or they...
At the end of the day, I think what it means to give somebody a constitutional right, which your rights come from God, the Constitution just recognizes them, is that they don't have to satisfy a government official that they have a really good need to exercise it, or they face atypical, not common risks. Beautiful point. Absolutely beautiful point there. Beautiful. Just take a screenshot. That is a beautiful point. Kagan's going to push back.
Where they face atypical risks.
Justice Kagan, anything further?
Mr. Clement, you said, I think in passing, that it would be fine if New York banned open carry so long as it allowed concealed carry. Is that correct?
Certainly that's consistent with the relief we're looking for. We're looking for some outlet to exercise our constitutional right to carry firearms outside the home.
Exactly.
How is it consistent with the history? I mean, the history seems very clear to me that it's sort of like the exact opposite of how we think about it now. In other words, that there are lots of places that wanted people to display their arms as a matter of transparency, and what they prohibited was the concealed carry. So I'm thinking that if you look to the history, you end up with a completely different set of rules from the ones that you are suggesting with respect to concealed versus open. And it's an example, I think, of the difficulties of looking to history, where people were operating on such different, to use your term, wavelengths.
So, Justice Kagan, first of all, I would have thought that, we'd sort of cross the bridge to use history in this context in Heller.
Boom. She drags him into some deep water that he doesn't want to get into. She's saying the history says that, you know what? We actually want you to show the gun so we have transparency. It's a pretty good point. And what does the lawyer do? He sits down in case precedent. He says, well, first of all, I would have thought, we sort of crossed that bridge when we used the history of Heller. He goes right back to case precedent. When you watch enough of these Supreme Court cases, the ones who win are the ones who sit down in case precedent.
But if we're going to look to history, I actually think
Mr. Clement, the question is how to use history. And, where do you look? How far do you look? Do you look to the 1920s when all these felon laws were passed, as well as...
Who were the felons in the 1920s? Take a guess. Take a guess. Who were the felons in the 1920s? Who were they? Who were the felons in the 1920s? Okay.
Public purpose laws of exactly the same kind as New York. So one question is, how far up do you look? Another question is, with what sense of flexibility do you look? And I think that this is an example of that. It's like, no, we're not going to ask for an exact analog because we realize that the world has changed and regulatory schemes are very different because regulatory interests are very different. If we tried to copy history, we would find ourselves in a world in which the only thing that a state could do is tell people, you can't carry it concealed, you have to carry it open.
So, Justice Kagan, let me give you an example of how I think the court should use history in this context. And I'll go exactly to the Georgia statute that was at issue in Nunn against Georgia. Now, that was a statute that on its face prohibited carrying simpliciter. So it didn't say open, it didn't say concealed. Now, the court that analyzed that reversed, vacated the indictment of somebody under the statute because the statute didn't specify and they didn't think that person had carried concealed. But when they looked at it, they interpreted it in light of the context at the time, and they thought, boy, it is not consistent with the Second Amendment. That court actually thought directly applied to the state, which is interesting. But they said that's not consistent with the Second Amendment to prohibit any means for carrying. Then, consistent with kind of the norms of the time, kind of almost as like a severability holding, dare I say it, they said, well, all right, the open carry, that's allowed. I mean, rather, that's we're going to say that to the extent this statute prohibits open carry, that's unconstitutional, but to the extent that it prohibits concealed carry, that's constitutional. Now, the fundamental problem with the law that carries over as a direct analogy is it gave no outlet to exercise the constitutional right to carry for self-defense. The norms of the time had a favoring for open carry over concealed. I will grant you that the norms of the time have flipped, and certainly in New York, based on the rest of their licensing regime, I assume that they would prefer that my clients carry concealed rather than openly. But I think that's the way you can use the history, and you can use it with some contextual sensitivity, but you cannot sort of, throw it all out, because I do think the analogy is pretty clean between a law that prohibits any form of carry and what New York is doing here. And of course, that was one of the laws that this court specifically looked to in the Heller decision as well.
And when you look at this history,
Once again, he said Heller. He goes back to Heller.
A properly contextual way, do you see no difference between the kind of regulation that was allowed in the home and the kind of regulation that was allowed in public places? Because it seems to me that the history, and Justice Sotomayor developed it at some length, but the history is replete with that distinction. And indeed, Heller recognizes that. Heller recognizes that the home is a very special place, both because, for similar reasons for the Fourth Amendment, but also because the need for self-defense is so much greater there.
Okay, so do you think you should be able to carry your gun in your home only or everywhere? Home or everywhere? Just type it right down here. I think you should be able to carry your gun everywhere, or I think you should only be able to have a gun in your home. Can you just put that there? Home or everywhere? I just want to know what you guys think, because she wants to make it so you can only have your gun in your house. Home or everywhere? Because I like to have my gun on me everywhere. I don't know about you, but that's just what I prefer. I like to have my gun on me. Makes me feel safer. I enjoy feeling safe. I don't just need it at home, even though sometimes I do carry my gun at home when I go into the shower. I carry my gun everywhere. So, I just can't understand what she's trying to say here. Everybody hit the like button real quick. Everybody take your thumb and hit the like button, your finger. Thanks.
Right there.
So I think in terms of, I'm not going to tell you that the context doesn't matter at all. I mean, take the sensitive places law, right? They don't really affect the keep right the way that they affect the carry right, unless you try to say the entirety of Manhattan is a sensitive place, and then they might affect both. But in general, the analysis is going to be slightly different. But I would say that, I don't think those differences are material here. I think if the district, instead of just banning handguns inside the home, had adapted a permitting regime that required district residents to show that they had an atypical need to possess a handgun inside the home, I'm not sure anything in Heller would have been different, because it's just inconsistent with a constitutional right to either ban the exercise of it or say that it's a privilege that you can only exercise if you show that you are atypical from the rest of the people who are equally protected by the constitutional right.
Thank you.
Mr. Clement, are you able to hear me?
Loud and clear.
Right. Some of your amici have asked us to provide further guidance to lower courts in cases beyond.
So when he says amici, what he's talking about is the amicus briefs. So some of the amicus briefs that he provided want further lower courts in cases beyond yours. They want some cases.
Your own. And so putting aside your case for the moment, they pointed out that some lower courts have refused to apply the history test, for example, and said they will not extend Heller outside the home until this court does. Other courts have applied intermediate scrutiny and variations of that. Some have suggested that strict scrutiny would be appropriate to treat this right comparably to other rights under our modern tiers of scrutiny. I'd just be curious what views you have about all that.
Thank you, Justice Gorsuch. I think we would start with the idea that text, history, and tradition is an appropriate way to deal with this right. That's what the court said in Heller. I think this court would allow the court to make clear that the same analysis applies outside of the home. And I think this case, like Heller, is such an outlier that the court wouldn't have to say too much more unless it wanted to. I think if it wanted to, though, it would already, I think, go a long way to correcting some of the mistakes in the lower court to say that text, history, and tradition is the test, not part of the test, but the test inside and outside the home. And if this court prefers to go the level of scrutiny route, I would simply say two things. One, we would prefer strict scrutiny as being consistent with a fundamental constitutional right. But even if it's going to be intermediate scrutiny, probably the single most important thing to remind the lower courts is that intermediate scrutiny requires narrow tailoring. And a law like this that takes a person who has no proclivity whatsoever, unlike the surety laws, to misuse firearms, and says you simply can't carry them for self-defense anywhere frequented by the public because you haven't demonstrated an atypical need. I mean, that's about as untailored a law as I can imagine. So I think if you did one of those two things, either make clear that it's text, history, and tradition outside the home as well as inside, or made clear that narrow tailoring is an integral component of the test, that would go a long way to clearing up some of the confusion in the lower courts.
And I know you've had a substantial debate with your friends on the other side about the Statute of Northampton. We haven't heard about that today, and I just wanted to give you a chance.
Thank you, Justice Gorsuch. I'd say just a couple of quick things about the Statute of Northampton. First of all, I think that it was very clear from the Knight's case and the treatises that this court relied on in Heller that by the time of the framing of the English Bill of Rights, that was not a general prohibition on carrying outside the home, but was a prohibition on either carrying unusual and dangerous weapons or using common weapons in a way that terrorized the public. And so I don't think that that supports the other side's position here. And the second thing I would say is that probably the single most obvious point about the history is there just are no reported cases on this side of the Atlantic, not in actual reporters, not in newspaper reports about crimes of the day, that show anybody being prosecuted for a violation of the Northampton crime simply by carrying common firearms for self-defense. And the one U.S. early court that dealt with this, the common law equivalent of the statute, was State against Huntley in North Carolina, which was an opinion that was cited favorably in the majority opinion in Heller. And that case went out of its way to say that simply carrying firearms per se is not an offense. It's the intent to terrorize the people that is prohibited by Northampton.
So in this case right here, it's going to be State against Huntley in North Carolina. And this was a state law, which the opinion was cited favorably in the majority opinion. So this case law here from the state was cited in the Heller opinion, and it went out of its way to say simply carrying a firearm is not an offense. If you use the firearm with an intent to terrorize the people, that's what's prohibited by the Northamptons. And then I just want to point out something. Neil Gorsuch right here, he's video conferencing in. So if you ever have court and the court says you can't video conference in, you ask them how come Neil Gorsuch can video conference in to a Supreme Court hearing. to Supreme Court oral arguments. How come he can video conference in and listen, but you don't have that same right in whatever state the court is trying to deny you the right to video conference in?
Thank you.
Justice Kavanaugh?
Mr. Clement, I have several questions. First,
He's over here.
I want to make sure I understand your main problem here with this permitting regime, as I understand it, is the discretion that's involved with the permitting officials, and your point that that's just not how we do constitutional rights, where we allow basic blanket discretion to grant or deny something for all sorts of reasons. But I understand you would not object or do not object to the regimes that are used in many of the other 42 states, the shall issue regimes. I mean, there could be particular problems with those, but I do not understand you to object to shall issue regimes. Is that accurate?
That's accurate, Justice Kavanaugh. And as you say, they're especially if you have something like good moral character, there's the possibility for discretionary abuse in those regimes as well. But the thrust of this case is, we'd like what they're having. We'd like what the people in the other 43 states are allowed to do and exercise their rights. And in many of those states, it's shall issue. And that is, of course, New York purports to have effectively a shall issue regime with respect to hunting. The only other caveat I wanted to add is it's the discretion combined with the atypicality requirement. So if they came up with some, sort of like magic wand that gave them a precise reading of typicality, and so there was no discretion, but the standard was still, at the end of the day, you have to show that you are atypical from the rest of the people protected by the Second Amendment.
So if they came up with some magic wand to give them a precise reading of the typicality of whether or not, or do you have to show that you have an atypical from the rest of the people protected by the Second Amendment?
We have a problem with that as well.
Right. A shall issue regime with an atypicality requirement wouldn't be no good in your view.
Exactly. Even if it could be somehow, if you could come up with some objective standard of typicality.
Okay. And the issue before us, as I understand it, is the permitting regime. We don't have to answer all the sensitive places questions in this case, some of which will be challenging, no doubt. Is that accurate?
That's 100% accurate, and it's sort of a market test of the accuracy of that, which is New York does have sensitive place laws, and we have not challenged them in this litigation.
And then to follow up on Justice Thomas's question, also Justice Gorsuch's, we should focus on American law and the text of the Constitution, and we don't start the analysis in a vacuum. But we started with the text, which you say grants the right to carry, and then historical practice can justify certain kinds of regulations, but the baseline is always the right established in the text. And there'll be tough questions as the arguments revealed about what the historical practice shows, but the default or baseline is the text. Right.
That's absolutely right, Justice Kavanaugh. And of course, that's no different from something like the First Amendment, where of course you start with the text, and it's very emphatic text, no law abridging speech. But then you look to history and tradition just to realize, oh, well, there's a long tradition of treating defamation and libel different going back to the framing. So you use that history to inform the text, but the focus is on the text.
And last question, following up on Justice Gorsuch's question, as he points out, some courts have used intermediate scrutiny or strict scrutiny. Those are balancing tests. I think Professor Alcia's amicus brief is very helpful on that. There's well-developed law in other areas. But it'll be no surprise.
I sure would like to read that. Anybody know where we can get that? Professor Alicia's amicus brief is very helpful on that. I would sure like to read that amicus brief. There are balancing tests is what Kavanaugh says. I think Professor Alicia's amicus brief is very helpful on balancing tests. I would love to read that amicus brief.
Those are balancing tests. I think Professor Alcia's amicus brief is very helpful on that. There's well-developed law in other areas. But it'll be no surprise to you. I have concern that would just be a balancing test that would make it a policy judgment, basically, for the courts. And I don't know why we would. You say you'd be okay with that, but I'm not sure why we would smuggle all that into here, and then it would just be a policy judgment that would be unanchored from the historical practice.
So, Justice Kavanaugh, 2 points just in response to that. One, as you articulate the concerns with interesting balancing, that might be a reason that if you're going to go with the level of scrutiny's approach, you would go to strict scrutiny, where I just think there's less play in the joints. But the second...
maybe, but what's a compelling interest? Do you have a there's a lot of play in the joints in some of the other areas, so I don't know that you want to open that door.
And the second point I was going to make, though, Justice Kavanaugh, which is maybe more consonant with the thrust of the question, is, whatever was the case in Heller, where I sort of read the majority opinion as actually already rejecting interesting balancing, but whatever was the case in Heller, we now have this 13 years of experience with lower courts applying the test. And in our view, they've made a muddle of it, and it's probably the experience of the last 13 years is probably a very good reason to prefer a text, history, and tradition approach to this area of the law.
Thank you.
Justice Barrett?
Mr. Clement, I have one question. So a couple times in response to my question about Times Square and New Year's Eve, and then just now as well to Justice Kavanaugh, you made reference to the First Amendment. And obviously, a lot of the questions that have been asked have been focused on how can the state fairly regulate? Because everybody agrees there have to be some regulations, and it might not be the case that we can.
No. Because everybody agrees there has to be some kind of regulations. This is a fallacy. She's making a conclusionary statement that everybody agrees there has to be some regulations. No, we don't all agree on that. That's an illogical or argumentative fallacy. That's what that is right there. And when you study fallacies long enough, you can spot them as soon as you see them. Everybody does not agree that there has to be some regulations, Amy. You're saying that.
Can always find exact historical analogs. So returning to the First Amendment, in response to me, you said, well, that might be analogous to a time, place, and manner restriction. So do you think the First Amendment and the edifices that we have structured around it would be a helpful place to look? Is that what you're suggesting?
Well, I'm suggesting that there is a lot of useful teaching in the First Amendment. I'm not sure I'm suggesting you should just take sort of doctrines lock, stock, and barrel from the First Amendment. But, going back, well over 100 years to like Robertson, when the court was just talking in dictum about the First and the Second Amendment, it drew the analogy between allowing some restrictions on the Second Amendment and in the First Amendment context, the First Amendment being consistent with libel and defamation. As I suggested to the Chief Justice, I think the way you think about a non-public forum and why that's different from First Amendment purposes from a park, I think could be useful in some of these contexts. If you focus on the nature of the location, you might say this is inappropriate for weapons, but in the same way as in the First Amendment, you just don't get to say, well, we're going to make it a non-public forum by saying no First Amendment activity there. You can't just take a location and say we're going to make this a sensitive place by saying no Second Amendment activity there. So those kind of analogies, and lastly, the analogy being you look at a law that says no concealed carry in a particular place on one night of the year quite differently from a law like this that says there's really no way for a typical New Yorker to conceal carry anywhere that the general public is allowed to go. Those under the First Amendment, those are radically different laws. And I think under the Second Amendment.
Okay, those are radically different laws. But I want you guys to consider something when you read this paragraph here. The analog you might say that says no concealed carry in a particular place on one night of the year, quite differently from a law that says blah, blah, blah. If there's going to be a law that no concealed carry in a particular place on one night of the year, if you're an insane madman and you know that there's no concealed carry in one place on one night of the year and you want to go out and get your name in lights and be on camera, then why wouldn't you target this one particular place on this one night of the year when they announce that nobody there will be carrying a gun? It's absolute stupidity. Where is and this lawyer's arguing the same thing I'm arguing, which is there shouldn't be any it's not what he's arguing, but the point is if this doesn't make any sense, no guns are going to be allowed at this place on this time, one time of the year, and there's going to be tens of thousands of people there. If you're a madman, that's where you go. We saw that in Las Vegas.
Those are radical.
And they didn't have those laws that you couldn't have guns on you in the Vegas killings.
Different laws.
Thank you.
Thank you, counsel.
Okay, so now we're going to go into the arguments for Bruen, which is they're going to argue that that we should be able to make sure that you don't get your gun rights. And that's another hour argument. So I'm going to get into that on another day, because I have to actually work on some lawsuits for the rest of the day today. I have to go into some stuff and really get into the nitty gritty of things that I'm putting together and writing. And so I've really got to just work the rest of today. I just got to focus. So, but I wanted to come on and just show you guys. And again, I want you to look at the analysis of what the lawyer does in the case. He's always going back to the case precedent. When you listen to enough of these, thanks for the super chats. I didn't see them come in. I was just reading the words on the screen. Thank you guys. I appreciate the super chat. God bless you. Trump t-shirts. I did see that go through. I just didn't want to interrupt. Thank you so much, man. I appreciate it. And so now we're going to listen to the other part tomorrow, but I've just got to get to work on some stuff I'm doing right now. I've got to finish the things I'm doing. So I want to just keep working on those. And so, it's like, if you say that no teachers, like someone just said, no teachers are going to be able to carry guns, well, then that tells a demented 14-year-old kid that if they know that no teachers have guns, well, then they can just go in there and start shooting everybody. And we're seeing that. We're seeing it. Most people don't carry their sidearm when they go into the grocery store. And then we saw in Brooklyn, the guy goes into a grocery store and he kills, 20 people or however many people he killed. And so every time you create one of these gun restriction zones, you get a madman who can't wait to go in there and kill a bunch of unarmed people because the state made it so that they were sitting ducks in a pond. I still can't get over the story I read about a woman who buried her husband. A woman buried a loved one, and she said that her firearm was sitting in her car as she was in the restaurant because the restaurant didn't allow people to carry guns inside the restaurant. And a madman came in and started shooting people and killed her husband or her father or her brother, killed someone right in front of her. And she said, "I'll never forget that my firearm was sitting in my car. And now my loved one is dead." Every time you create one of these safe spaces, or we're going to ban guns from this one place on this one night of the year, you're opening that up for mad people, for people who are crazy. Remember Adam Lanza, who killed all those kids in Sandy Hook. You got to remember, he killed his mom and stuffed her under the bed and then took her guns. There's no limit to what someone will do. There's no limit to, the story we're given about Vegas, which, the Vegas shooting where they shot, 50 people at a concert or something like that, some horrific number of people who died there. Was it 80? Was it 100? I don't remember how many people died. But, the story is, because I heard something different than with the story, but the story, the narration of that is that he trucked in guns and ammunition for weeks, that he inside of cases and different suitcases, he trucked in guns and bullets for weeks. But then when you saw the inside of the room, there should have been shell casings all over the floor. There should have been just casings everywhere. But that if you've shot in your lifetime before, there should be casings everywhere. I don't want to get into the conspiracy theories of things. But anyway, make sure you guys share this video, take a look at this video, share the video, and I'm going to get back to work on the lawsuits I'm filing and the lawsuits I'm continuing working on. I have to amend my own complaint against Wagner versus DeCastro. And then make sure everybody knows, if you guys want to get the trifold, I changed it to $5 trifold. It's now, you use the code $5 trifold at checkout and it costs you $5. That's for the $15 version one. And if you buy it, I appreciate it. Thank you very much. If not, you can get the Indestructible one for $25. And that's what I do for a living. So I have, want to make sure you guys have one of those in your car. Okay. Anyway, I'm going to get the flock out of here and I will see you guys on the next one. And just remember one thing, under no circumstances do we stop. We never stop. Don't stop fighting back. Don't stop using your energy and your power, even if people are going to manipulate and use your energy for their own gain. You just keep going. Don't stop. Don't let anybody detract you. You keep going. Fight for liberty, for justice. I love America. I love this country. I'm going to do the best that I can to change it. We don't stop. All right, I'm going to get the flock out of here. I'll see you guys on the next one.